We didn't affect animal welfare, but at the same time, we were able to prolong the cage change. And we ended up changing 58% less cages in our study compared to a standard 2-week change. And we did these studies for close to 18 months. So pretty comprehensive long-term studies, 4 arms of the study.
Welcome to The Last Word, the official AALAS podcast dedicated to connecting and informing the laboratory animal science community. Each episode takes a closer look at recent articles published in our journals, JAALAS and LAS Pro, and features interviews with professionals advancing the field. I'm Jennifer Smith, your host. As a laboratory animal veterinarian and the Director of Education and Scientific Affairs at AALAS, I look forward to sharing these conversations with you. Let's discover something new together. Welcome. Today in this episode, I am joined by a fellow colleague, Dr. Jeetendra Eswaraka, BVSc, PhD, DACLAM, and EACLAM. Dr. Eswaraka, or G2 as his friends call him, is the VP of University-wide Core Services and the AV at Rutgers University. He obtained his veterinary degree from Madras Veterinary College and completed his lab animal training at the University of Tennessee Health Sciences Center, where he also completed his PhD. G2 is a diplomat of ACLAM and ECLAM, and today he is with us to discuss a really exciting paper. I can't wait to get into it. It's titled Using Machine Learning and Predictive Artificial Intelligence to Determine Cage Change Frequency for Mouse Housing in Individually Ventilated Cages and to Drive Vivarium Operational Efficiency. Wow, that was a mouthful. Okay, G2. Please tell us a little bit about yourself. We're going to jump into the paper, but we want to just know a little bit about you, your background, how you got into this crazy career that we're in, and anything else you want to share.
Yeah, so thank you, Jennifer, for inviting me for this podcast. And in terms of my career, I'm an accidental lab animal vet.
I love it.
After my vet school, I did some private practice and some equine training, but kind of like research pulled me in. So I came to my PhD to the University of Tennessee. I started my PhD in molecular virology and pathogenesis. And during that time, I met some really nice lab animal vets at the University of Tennessee. And along with my PhD, I kind of did my residency as well. And it just was a very fulfilling time at Memphis. And ended up staying there for 12 years. My first job was there as well. And then I went into industry and was there for about a total of 16 years. And then moved back into academia, where now I head up the lab animal program at Rutgers University.
Wow. I'm so excited to hear that. And I think you might be the first guest that's claimed to be an accidental laboratory animal veterinarian. I love it. I love that description. That is a good one. I think that covers a lot of us. So I'm glad that you said that. And I love hearing about your background. You've just got a wealth of experience and knowledge, and I think just the perfect person to collaborate in bringing this kind of machine learning AI forward into what we do in our industry every day. So we are excited about that. All right, so tell us about this project. Why did you take it on? What were you thinking or not thinking? Go ahead and tell us.
Yeah, one of the things I've been struck moving from academia, industry to academia, and also in general being in the lab animal industry, is our industry has been kind of very traditional, right? And we have a business model that is now starting to strain because we are now faced with the situation, especially now with the federal funding cuts that's happening. We have to find efficiencies in everything that we do. And one of the things that we all know in our field is the biweekly cage change that we do on a routine basis across animal facilities in the US. And this is the ones that are on individually ventilated cages, right? Racks. When they're static isolators or they're open top caging, they get changed either twice a week or once a week because the cages get really dirty and ammonia accumulates. Whereas in IVCs, people by default change once in 2 weeks, even though there are a lot of papers out there that say that depending upon the number of animals in a cage, you can vary the cage change frequency to up to 4 weeks, and in some cases 6 weeks, without affecting animal welfare. However, it's a practical problem why this is not widely used in the industry, because when you have a large number of cages, it's extremely difficult for the staff at the room level to identify, oh, I changed this cage on a Tuesday, and now this cage is due in like 5 weeks and in this particular day because it has one animal, right? So it's never been possible to implement it on a wide scale. And also, if you think about what we call as dirty, is based on a visual assessment of dirtiness, right? We looked at either the size of the urine spot, or we say, oh, there's a lot of feces in the cage. And therefore, that's how we determine dirtiness. And that itself brings in a level of inconsistency, because how one technician thinks is dirty versus a PI thinks is dirty versus another technician thinks is dirty. So it's very inefficient and inconsistent. And it's so simple to change every 2 weeks. And part of the problem of changing every 2 weeks is, let's assume that today, the Wednesday, is the day the cage change is going to happen in this particular room, right? But a PI might have come and just split the cages where they weaned a lot of animals into new cages yesterday, which is a Tuesday. But then every single cage is going to get changed in the room, because that's what the technician is being charged with, is to change the cages on this particular day. So if you think about operational efficiency or rather inefficiency, it's been inherent and exists in our current practices. And so we wanted to look at, are there technologies out there that can help us to come up with potentially one, a quantitative assessment of what a dirtiness in a cage is, and then be able to track it and also alert because for a technician at the room level, you want to make it as easy as possible to change a cage, right? So if a system can come up and say, hey, this cage needs to be changed today, they're more likely to do it on a very consistent basis. So that's how we started this process. We examined a lot of different technologies out there, and then we came across this digital ventilated cages, which have actually been in the industry since 2016, but nobody had actually used this to look at operational efficiency in terms of cage changes. We decided to use this one because this technology is a sensor board that sits underneath the cage, and it measures wetness in the cage, or rather, because you can use it for multiple different purposes, right? Because the capacitance board, which is under the cage, when you put a body of water on top of it, it drops the capacitance. Now, you can use that to either look at saturation of bedding with urine and therefore dirtiness, or it can also be used for locomotion. I have another paper that's coming out tracking locomotion of animals using the same drop in capacitance using these boards. For this paper, we decided to focus on the bedding status index, and our resident Joseph Collins was the one who did all of the work for the study. And we wanted to test it out with different conditions, right? Because again, the amount of urine a mouse produces is going to change based on the size of the mouse, the strain of the mouse, and also the disease pathology that can happen in the mouse. So, and when you add all of these factors in, unless you have an impartial method, way in which you can measure cage wetness, it's very difficult to say, oh, the cage is wet or and it needs to be changed. So that's kind of the background about how we started this project. So I know that is a long-winded answer for you.
No, that is great. Thank you. And what a great summary. I love it. So we got through kind of quite a bit of the background and kind of your introduction, which is fantastic. I wondered if you could just quickly introduce the team. I know you mentioned Joseph, but maybe you could introduce the rest of the team. We know that it always takes a team to get a paper out the door and in publications. So we'd love to know who you worked with.
Yeah, absolutely. Joseph Collins is our third-year resident in my program. And then Bhupinder Singh is the director of veterinary services and also the director for the residency program. So he manages the day-to-day activities of the residents. Mike Zwick is my boss, senior vice president for research. And he's been very supportive of us investing in this technology. And he's been always checking in to see, hey, how is this project going? I'm excited about this. And he did some edits on the papers and gave us some feedback on our results. So that's great. for a vice president. No, I mean, and usually senior vice presidents don't get involved in what happens in animal facilities.
That is absolutely, you know what? That's absolutely fantastic. I want to call that out because I don't usually hear that when authors describe the team, and I love it because you're right. It means that you've got a lot of support from above, and it sounds like your program is, incredibly supportive of what you're doing, and as they should be, right? As well as having this operational excellence only helps everyone. So I love that. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you. And then Giorgio Rosati, he's the one who came up with this whole concept of the digital caging with the sensor board, because originally he was hired to, because, one of the things when you have automatic watering in IBC cages, right, you have floods, and he was tasked with coming up with a method to detect flooding of cages. And that's how he came up. He's an engineer, and he came up with this board that goes under these cages, sensory board. So he's the one who's developed this technology at Technoplast, and he's in charge of the development of the entire DVC program. So he has been very supportive, helping us with what to do with our system. And then we generate a lot of data. We capture data every 250 milliseconds in the cage, and it's being captured 24/7. That's a lot of data that needs to be analyzed in order to develop the algorithms, right? Because you have to develop an algorithm so that the system can alert you instead of us having to do the calculation, which should never happen. So Mara Rigamonti is the data scientist who worked with us to crunch these numbers and come up with the bedding status index algorithm. Christian, he's the one that helps us. He's also from, when you implement technology, you always run into problems, right? And hey, this board, something went wrong, or I'm having errors come up and things like that. So throughout this project, Christian has been helping us with making sure that everything is running as it should, and helping our resident whenever he runs into problems with data analysis and stuff like that. And of course, the last person is me. So
Yes. Wow. I mean, that is a power team. I love how you've just got a great wealth of experience there behind this study. And I really appreciate that you also called out the data, because that's a lot of data, as you said. So I appreciate that you had specialists working on that as well. So let's jump back into the introduction. There were two things in here that really stood out. You talk a lot about the performance standard, which you did so well in the introduction, and I think that's important. And then this acronym, this BSI, Bedding Status Index. And I wonder if you could just kind of talk a little bit about those and how those kind of morphed into the project then.
when mice produce urine and we have bedding on the floor to absorb it, right? And then the bedding gets absorbed and it evaporates, and that's how the IVC cages are set up. There's enough air changes in the cage to remove that ammonia that would be produced in the cage. So as the bedding gets saturated with the urine, it is detected by the board at the bottom, and you see a drop in the capacitance of the board. And that is actually in figure.
Yes, so that's figure 2, which is pretty cool. It's pretty cool to see. I felt like that was a really great addition to the paper, and I loved how you described the initial number of that capacitance is kind of irrelevant, right? It's the drop that matters. So for people like me who aren't data savvy, I loved hearing that.
Yeah, so we start with an initial value, and then we come up with the final value. And then that's the value that you say, hey, this, when it gets to this level in our facility, because again, every facility is going to define dirtiness differently, right? So that's why we use an already published criteria that is using urine spots that is already in our literature as our standard to train the system. So this is Ida Washington from Washington. She had published this paper about the size of the urine spots and correlated with ammonia levels inside a cage. So since that is a published standard within the industry, and many facilities actually use that as a standard for cage sheet, we decided to use that criteria to train the algorithm so that it correlates that wetness with the drop in capacitance and that bedding status index value to then alert us to change a cage. And there's a formula that is there, and it's there in our materials methods.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's time for a quick break to hear about the AALAS Learning Library. Hey, are you ready to elevate your team's knowledge and skills in laboratory animal science? Well, the AALAS Learning Library is your one-stop solution for comprehensive training. With courses designed for everyone, you can train your entire team in one place, earn valuable AALAS CEUs and RACE CE credits, and take advantage of group discounts to maximize that investment. Getting started is easy too. Sign up for free to access select courses instantly to explore a vast library of resources. Empower your team, stay ahead of the field, and grow with the AALAS Learning Library, your trusted resource for laboratory animal science professionals. So let's just talk a little bit more about just the study design, because I think you hinted on that a little bit, but maybe you could just tell us, there was sort of this training phase, right, for the algorithm with different strains, and then how that kind of morphed into actually validation. And then, of course, we'll talk at the end about what you found, but we'd love to know more about those.
There's a lot of things we had to standardize before we even started the studies, right? One of the things we found is, in general, across our facilities, just to be standardized the amount of bedding, right? Because when there's enough publications showing that when you have too much bedding, it causes actually more ammonia to be retained in a cage. And then if you have too less bedding, the animals are in contact with the bottom of the cage, which is not good. So we had to come up with a volume of bedding that actually absorbs enough urine, so therefore there's no wet spots in the cage, and at the same time is not too high that it increases the distance between the animal and the board, as well as the fact that it can tend to cause these spots which urine accumulates. So we use paper bedding, which is about 2.5 times more absorptive than corncob bedding, which is what used to be our standard. And then we came up with 350 mLs of bedding as our ideal volume to be used in this study. And the other thing is we also had to look at our food, because when mice start shredding the food and then the shredded food starts to accumulate inside the cage, when a mouse sits on top of it, the distance between the board and the mouse increases, and therefore you don't really capture data. So we then actually used extruded diets, which the mice don't shred. The nutrient value is the same, but at the same time, it doesn't shred as easily. And therefore, we could get really consistent data. So those are two parameters we had to standardize much before the study. And then, because this is about operational efficiency and we are interested in implementing it across the board, throughout our institution, right? We wanted to start out with the most difficult thing that you can throw at the system. Because in a typical animal facility, when you walk into a room, you'll have different investigators using the same room, and animals from different strains, different sizes, different ages will be there on the rack. So our very first experiment, what we did was we did a mixed strain study where we just asked investigators to donate mice. And we got both male and female mice. And then we grouped them and also we wanted to do a larger number of cages. Typically, many other publications, if you see, would have been published with 5 cages, 10 cages in a group, right? We started with 20 cages per group. And we had 5 animals, 4 animals, 3 animals, 2 and 1 animals, respectively. So about 300 mice and 100 cages. And we wanted to go a long time, right? Studies typically ran between 16 to 18 weeks. So that, it's not one result that biases you. We wanted to be really sure this works. And so then what would happen is we put the mice into the cage, and we call that as a learning phase, because this is the first phase where we, using Ida Washington's paper, we trained all our technicians on, because we wanted everybody to know what it would be considered as a standard for dirtiness, right? We took 5 people. We included vet techs and animal care technicians, and we trained them on what is the size of the urine spot that is going to be considered as dirty for the study. And then once they're all reading things consistently the same, then we started the study. So once we did this, we put all the animals into the cage and then waited for the system to alert us when it sees, as it is, we were giving feedback to the system initially saying, hey, this cage is ready to change, right? And the system is learning, okay, this facility is asking us to change the cages, and this is the corresponding bedding status index value. And then it starts to learn from that. And so the very first study was with the mixed strains. And then once we had the data from that, which is very, very encouraging, because what we found is that when you have one mouse per cage, even at 7 weeks, the cages were not didn't look dirty to any of our scoring people, and we didn't really see big urine spots. But I had to stop the study because you had to put an end date. So we put it as 7 weeks in this for a single mouse. But what was very encouraging to us is we were able to replicate majority of things that are already in the literature. If you have 5 animals per cage, we were going around 21 to 28 days for the most of the cages. And then when you have like 2 animals, you can go close to 38 days. So it was very encouraging for us. So then, of course, when people ask you to look at study, they say you want age match them, sex match them, right? And so that was our next study. So we did a C57 Black 6 was our next study. And in that one, we just took equal numbers of 6-week-old male and female mice. We didn't find a lot of difference between 1 and 2 mice. There are 4 and 5 mice in a cage. So for that study, we started to use, going forward, we said we'll use only 2 mice, 3 mice, and 5 mice as our group sizes. And again, 20 cages per cohort. And again, we wanted to do a learning phase, right? We did it for 6 weeks and then a validation phase. In the validation phase, what we are doing is we're just changing the cage when the system alerts us. But if the cage is too clean and the system tells us we need to change the cage, we'll tell it as the feedback we give is this too clean. Or sometimes what happens is the system might wait too long, right? It might go 4 weeks, and we would say, oh no, this cage needs to be changed today. So that we'll call it too dirty, and then the system starts to learn from that. Using this kind of training and validation phases, we did C57 Black 6 study, and then we did the BAB-C studies because BAB-Cs tend to be a little bit more dirtier than the C57 in terms of soil in the cage, but we didn't see a whole lot of difference between the two, but it came out good. And then we said, okay, now we have this one. Are there situations where you can potentially have to change the cage earlier than what we know as 2 weeks, right? So we had a lot of Swiss Websters from breeding study. We used Swiss Websters as foster moms for some of the other studies we are doing. So we had a lot of them left behind, like 28 cages of them. So we took those cages and they are retired breeders. So these mice were really big and they produce a lot of urine. And when we did the study with these mice, what we found is that sometimes you have to change the cage as early as 8 days. You can't even wait 2 weeks. So that was encouraging because now you have bigger mice producing more urine getting changed earlier, and the younger mice which produce less urine getting changed out later. So that is one of the, I think, the advantages of our study. But again, we just didn't want to use just the visual scoring of soiling where you're looking at feces or wetness of the wet spots as the only way to measure whether the cage is dirty or not. So we measured ammonia levels, and we measured ammonia levels in 3 places. One where the mice tend to separate out their places where they nest and where they defecate or urinate, right? So they usually see 2 zones. We call this a latrine spot. So we measured urine ammonia levels at the urine spot as well as the nesting area. And then in the middle of the cage, we hung a ammonia reader, which is a qualitative measure, not a quantitative measure. But with the urine spot, the latrine spot and the bedding, and the nesting areas, we actually use a quantitative reader to measure the ammonia levels. And what we found is that you don't really see a lot of ammonia accumulation, especially because these cages have 75 air changes in them. And it is very effective at scavenging out the ammonia. And our results might be a little different compared to what is published in literature with corn cob, right? Because I think all depends upon how your bedding absorbs and dries out. And in the paper bedding, you don't really see the wet spot accumulating under the bedding like we see in corn cob, because these pellets swell up and then they dry as the air in the cage circulates. So, that's probably why we saw very little ammonia accumulation. There were maybe 1 or 2 cages which had a spike, but they never reached the threshold of cause, the 25 ppm, which is the threshold for human tolerance. And then there's a paper out there which says around 50 ppm, you start seeing nasal erosion. We didn't really reach those levels. Then we also wanted to measure CO2 levels in the cage. And again, we didn't really see any significant difference between CO2 levels versus weight gains in the animals. So we took individual weights weekly And then we compared it against what the JACS publishes as their standard in their facility. So again, we did a lot of different these parameters just to make sure that the animals are healthy. And then because the system also detects the movement of animals in the cage, we didn't put it in the paper because it would have been too much data. We actually were measuring circadian rhythm, right? Because I know people ask about stress. I mean, our results basically showed that animals didn't get stressed because we didn't see any change in sleep patterns. We didn't see activity patterns at nighttime or daytime of the mice, indicating that they didn't really undergo any stress. So it is all very good to us, right, in terms of making sure that we didn't affect animal welfare. But at the same time, we were able to prolong the cage change, and we ended up changing 58% less cages in our study compared to a standard 2 week change. And we did these studies for close to 18 months. So, pretty comprehensive long term studies, 4 arms of the study.
Wow. I mean, there is so much there. Thank you for taking us through that, your kind of your materials, how you did the study, and then you cover the results, which is great. So thank you. There's so much that's interesting. I think the not seeing spikes in ammonia is also extremely interesting, and I'm so glad that you brought up the differences in the bedding, because I'm sure that's a variable that people would want to know about. And then just all of the other things as far as strain, weight, activity, potential stress. So I really appreciate how comprehensive this study was. So let's talk about just kind of what's in the discussion of your paper. What are some of the things that you found that were, somewhat surprising? Any limitations? What, maybe you would have done differently? This is always a great time to discuss that.
I think our studies were fairly comprehensive, so I don't think we would have done anything different. But what is interesting for us is when you have the paper bedding, sometimes when you go too long, right? I mean, there was the initial part of the study, when we were, even before we started the study, what we noticed is if the cages went too long and the mice trampled on the paper bedding can crumple, then it starts to stick to the bottom of the cage. That again was a criteria that you don't really see the clear wet spots that you would see like in a corn cob bedding. So we had to incorporate that into the study as one of the criteria. So no, you absolutely need to change the cage. You cannot go to that part, to this stage. And that is one of the things. And then most literature that is there talks about single house animals going maybe up to 4 weeks. The fact that we went 7 weeks and you couldn't really see the cage getting dirty was very surprising to us. And again, this is not in this paper, but what was interesting for us is we have found data using the system that cage change is actually much more stressful to these mice than other activities that we do with the cage. And we are exploring that further because there are more studies that are coming out where we are looking at that, because it depends upon your strain of mice as well as the phenotype of the mouse. I mean, especially we have a lot of neuroscience models, and when you change the cage, they get kind of freaked out. It can take them up to 8 to 10 days to come back to normal circadian rhythm. Whereas a regular C57 Black 6 or a BAB-C, within 24 to 48, maybe up to 72 hours, they come back to normal circadian rhythm after a cage change. And this is mainly because we're disrupting all their pheromones, right? I mean, they like to mark their cages and use olfactory cues to exist. And when we disrupt them, I think it causes a lot of stress. And then they start marking the cages, and then we see aggression. When you asked about what is a surprise, right? We all know about C57 Black 6 males fighting when they group house, right? There's a lot of papers saying that about after 8 weeks of age, you can group house them. But when we did this extended cage changes, we have mice which are about a year old. They group house 5 mice to a cage, males, and they don't fight. That is very surprising. And we believe it is because of these extended cage changes and that they have enough time to set up their dominance over the others, that mice, once they accept that social hierarchy, they don't start fighting. Again, these are things that would have to be explored further in terms of, and now that we have the tools to do it, could be a study for a future resident to look at.
Wow. Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up. That is fascinating. And yeah, that would be really great to unpack with a future projects. So your next resident, I think.
Yes.
So we would love to know too, kind of now that you have this data, you're very confident in the length and the robustness of the study. We'd love to know sort of how are you using this now at your home institution, and are you
Yes.
able to use it?
Again, this is a big cultural change. And whenever you do change, you want to be slow, right? Because the system also produces a lot of data that is useful for research. I have to play and we have invested the money to buy this system as well as we got a grant to expand the system. What we are trying to do right now is put in as many of the experimental cages as possible so PIs are able to get data along with our operational efficiency. For those ones, each PI has to put in an amendment into their protocol, getting approval for extended cage change, which is not our standard, right? And then as people come onto the system, now we've started to put their breeding cages on. And we now started to collect data that is not in the paper now. But again, even with breeding cages, what we are seeing is we can get a minimum of 3 weeks with 5 mice per cage. So as we are accumulating more data, we provide the data to the PI for them to put an amendment in, and they go to the IACUC to get approval. So we have about 3,700 cages that we could put into use right away, but I have only 1,400 on there right now because it is part of, you have to train your staff. You have to then make sure your supervisors are on board with everything that's happening, because it's about building the capacity with your staff first and then with the PIs. So we actually had PIs score in the study on what is considered as dirty cage, and they all agree that with the bedding status index change. So doing the slow transition, so we were about 400 cages in April. Now we have 1,400 cages. The next few months, we plan to go up to 3,700 cages on the system, and then we'll start to see the real operational efficiency in a larger level in the facility. And then we have building a new facility that is going to be all 100% these kind of cages. So we're thinking long term, and we would rather be slow, make sure everybody is coming along with the change rather than just rush in and then get people upset.
Thank you so much for describing that, and thank you for your transparency in that, and just giving us I feel like we're all kind of along with you on this ride of how to make a big change, right? I mean, this is big in our industry, and so it's just really amazing to see how thoughtful and collaborative this change is at your institution, and the success of it is amazing. So, wow, really great there. I also really appreciated your transparency in the discussion section around the finances, because I think, especially as you mentioned at the beginning of the interview here, just with our current funding changes potentially, and how some of the incorporation of this technology could equate to a financial dividend there. And so I do appreciate your transparency there. Is there anything in the financial sort of calculation that was surprising to you?
Yeah, I didn't expect to the level because I was expecting return on investment potentially 10 years, right? But now we believe that it's going to be much faster because it depends on how you calculate your ROI. If you're buying IVC rack and the technology, then potentially 7 years. But if you already have the racks that you're going to retrofit with the technology, you can get a return on investment in 4 years, which is pretty awesome, right? And then it actually justifies me being able to convert more of the existing cages that we have into using this technology. So that's kind of the method in which we are going around. I never expected that we would change close to 60% less cages. I thought maybe 10%, 20%, and the surprising that we consistently are changing less, 50 to 60%. I mean, just to be transparent, this is one of our rooms which has all breeders as well as experimental animals. We converted them to this system in second week in May, and we're already past first change. So if we had done the 2 week change, we would have changed 198 cages. So far, we've changed only 58 cages.
Yeah, that is really remarkable. How interesting. Well, G2, I could talk to you about this all day. This is fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners will reach out because you really are on the front line of this. And we so appreciate, again, you supporting JAALAS with this research, this paper. Thanks to your team for taking this on. It has been really great talking to you. We always ask our guests one final question. So we'd love to know, and our questions are always kind of the same. And that would be, kind of what advice would you give somebody who wants to do something similar at their institution? So, we know that we can't take your data and plug it into our institution and call it good, right? We've got to get that performance standard for ourselves. What advice would you give someone?
I would say be deliberate about how you're doing it, because you want to, it's like any change management, right? You can't expect to buy the rack, turn it on, and hope it works. There's going to have to be somebody who's really invested in it in order to make it work for the institution. So you need a champion in your own team that is actually following through on everything that needs to happen. And then from a director perspective, you need to be able to convince the management as well as the faculty, right? Because they all need to be on board. I do that. And then my staff, a couple of my staff members are very focused on working with the animal care technicians and then the postdocs and graduate students that are using the room. Because you have to do probably your own study, because what you have considered as dirtiness in your facility might be different than ours. So you want to make sure that you use that criteria to train the system. Otherwise, if you use our criteria, your investigators may not agree with you on what is a dirty cage, right? So getting everybody's buy-in is important. You don't probably need to do the extensive number of studies that we did, but potentially at least one study, so that one, you become familiar with the system. Then number two is your staff are familiar with the system, because it's a big change on how to use. I guess it's true for any technology implementation that you want to make sure you address your cultural change first. Change management is probably the most important one, I would say, for success.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. And I love the tie-in. That's just good for any new technology, of course. This was so great. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you again. We cannot wait to see your other papers that you kind of hinted at. So we're hoping those will be in JAALAS as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Last Word. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so be sure to leave your feedback in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more great content. We encourage you to submit your research manuscripts to our journals, JAALAS and LAS Pro. We're always looking to feature impactful studies. You can also connect with us on our social media channels or email us directly at info@aalas.org. We appreciate your listening today, and we'll see you next time on The Last Word, an AALAS podcast. Until then, stay curious and stay connected.